David Carrick admitted in court yesterday to abusing and sexually assaulting 12 women from 2003 to 2020. Prosecutors described the offenses as a, quote, relentless campaign of sexually and mentally abusing women. Carrick was arrested in October 2021 after a woman came forward. However, that victim decided not to proceed with the allegation.
This news is both shocking and unsurprising.
Just disturbing, in one word. David Carrick admitted to being a serial rapist, pleading guilty to 24 counts of rape and a total of 49 different charges, including sexual assault and attempted rape. And those cases go back nearly 2 decades. He apparently systematically isolated his victims. This was profoundly psychological. And he used his job as a police officer to gain their trust. Apparently, the severity of the offences increased as he believed that he was getting away with it and could get away with it. One of the prosecutors involved said, quote, "The scale of the degradation Carrick subjected his victims to is unlike anything I've encountered in 34 years on the job." Of course, what makes this particularly disturbing is that these cases came to light in 2021 when he was arrested and suspended from duty. But there were multiple accusations of harassment and assault against him while still a serving police officer going back many years, none of which resulted in criminal charges or the loss of his job.
So a London police officer has admitted to many counts of sexual assault and a litany of other forms of harassment against women, and has used his position as a police officer in order to get away with it. But the unfortunate reality is that this is really more the exception than it is the rule, because this person is actually facing some type of criminal consequence. The harsh reality is that both in the UK and in the United States, there are countless police officers that get away with extreme amounts of abuse. And it's very rare that it ever gets covered by the press, much less there's any type of consequence for it. And it all really stems down to the institution of policing itself and the material reality of what police officers do for a living and how our society organizes police force. Now, while there may be theoretically procedures in place to prevent this from happening, the truth of the matter is all of the procedures that exist are not really preventative. They are things that exist to punish when it's discovered, but even then, there are many roadblocks to anything being discovered. Because even when there are accusations, like in this case, for example, there were accusations in the past that simply got disregarded, because things tend to be internal within police departments, it's very rare that they will even believe somebody coming in with an accusation. Which is just layered on top of the baseline misogyny that exists in the United States of America and the Western world in general, where women who are victims of sexual assault are very often not believed at all in the first place, much less when they're accusing somebody in a position of power, and even less when they're accusing somebody like a police officer, where their fellow co-workers would be the ones investigating them. And so the unfortunate reality is that there are many police officers that get away with this on a regular basis and use their position as a tool to sexually harass and abuse women. Because while procedures might exist that aim to prevent these sort of things, at the end of the day, the material reality when it comes to police officers is that their coworkers are most often their friends, and they are a person with a gun, and the people that they are arresting are not typically people with guns. And not only that, but the state supports and defends the use of force from the police officers, which means there's an inherent assumption that force that police officers use is justified, which fundamentally means there's an extreme imbalance of power anytime there's any interaction between a police officer and a civilian, where the presumption is that they are ones that are allowed to use force, that they have guns, and you do not. That is the material reality. And there's no amount of procedure that can actually change that. You have to fundamentally change what policing means in order for that issue to go away. And one of the first things that you can do is what many countries have done, which is quite literally disarm their police officers, or put in some sort of requirement where if they want to get their gun from their trunk, they have to call into the main office to report its use. That brings the stakes down for everyone and makes it a lot easier for people to escape abusive situations involving police officers. It also makes it far less likely for police officers to kill random innocent people. But in the United States, of course, we have an obsession with guns, and so many people just don't want to do that. In fact, there are tons of people that want to give tanks to police officers and actually increase the amount of arms that they have access to, which only escalates the problem further. Because then you go into the office culture of police departments and see what it looks like, and you recognize that across the United States and the Western world generally, not only is there a pretty high level of baseline misogyny and racism that exists, but there also tends to be this culture of us versus them, where police officers quite literally view themselves as an occupying force, and they view the residents of wherever they're policing as this like mysterious other that's somehow directly threatening to them instead of the people that they're supposed to theoretically be protecting. And that just leads to this systematic dehumanization of basically anybody that isn't a police officer. And then of course there's just the reality of police officers being friends with each other. You put all these things together and then you start to realize that when police officers are the ones in charge of enforcing policy and monitoring each other's behavior, there's not really going to be very much of that. There's going to be an extreme amount of distrust of anybody that isn't a police officer. There's going to be an inherent bias towards believing whatever police officers say, no matter how much evidence shows that police officers are lying. And there's going to be a ton of excuses for other police officers' behavior. And this is how you get stats like the estimated 40% of police officers across the country that are domestic abusers. Because fundamentally, they know they're going to get away with it. Because most of the times, they do. And this is why we need a complete overhaul of our entire system of justice. The overwhelming majority of things that police officers respond to literally do not require an armed response, especially when you're talking about things like traffic tickets. It is just wholly unnecessary for somebody to respond to a speeding ticket with a gun. And so when it comes to traffic control, that should just be an entirely different agency. But then when you look at things like helping homeless people, responding to mental health crises, and all these other things, you realize that not only are police officers very ill-equipped to deal with these things, but there are also a ton of people who are unarmed in our society that work in jobs responding to these things that are not police officers that also don't kill people. There are tons of people that work, for example, in group homes for people with severe mental illnesses or disabilities who very regularly respond to mental health crises and don't end up killing people. Those people would be far more qualified to respond to mental health crisis calls than a police officer. And when you start looking at all these different things, you start to realize that the whole idea of having this occupation force in our country is entirely unnecessary, because the only thing that it really does is create an environment where you have violent people who get into these positions because of very often violent tendencies that they want to express rather than a genuine interest in helping people. And then you get these office cultures that are just rife with sexual assault and harassment. And this is why there's so many people across the country that are calling for the abolition of police departments. Because when you look at the numbers, it just does not make sense to keep this institution around. It is wholly unnecessary. Because whenever you have somebody that is in a position of power, that is abusing that power, the first step to accountability is for that person to be entirely removed from any position of power so that they cannot continue their harm. That is the first step. And that is also the step that police officers are the least willing to take amongst their own. And no matter what reforms or policies or procedures are put in place that are theoretically intended to prevent this sort of thing, the reality is, at the end of the day, the police officers are men with guns that are showing up to situations that don't need to have guns involved. And as long as their coworkers are their friends, accountability is going to be hard to find, which means instead of looking at training or procedures or whatever, we need to look at real structural changes to fundamentally change what policing even means in the first place. Otherwise, this is going to continue happening.